Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Patrick Gaspard, the President and CEO of the Center for American Progress. Thank you for joining us today. I'm really quite thrilled to be introducing this critical discussion about sectoral standard setting in the US and in the world, and what we can learn from one another. As you may know, this fall, the state of California passed a historic bill called the Fast Recovery Act to create sectoral council for fast food workers. This is transformational. It's one of the most important pro-worker bills in a generation, and at CAP, we're incredibly proud to have been key and early supporters. Indeed, my extraordinary colleague, David Madlin, wrote a book urging states to adopt this type of sectoral policy. And I'm proud that CAP, myself included, helped to make the case to lawmakers and the public that the legislation would build power and improve the lives of fast food workers across the state. In addition to California, 4 other states, as well as 3 other cities, have enacted similar policies. Home care in Nevada, nursing homes in Michigan, agriculture in Colorado and New York, domestic workers in Seattle and Philadelphia, and multiple industries in Detroit. And it doesn't stop there. More jurisdictions are likely to follow. This kind of sectoral standard setting isn't just a growing US trend, but rather part of a worldwide movement. Labor unions around the world are leading this push for sectoral bargaining to complement workplace bargaining. At CAP, we've partnered with unions in the US, in Europe, New Zealand, and Australia to learn and share best practices to increase union membership and collective bargaining coverage. In September of last year, the European Union enacted a watershed directive that promotes sectoral bargaining to ensure that collective bargaining covers at least 80% of workers in member countries. In November, New Zealand passed a groundbreaking new sectoral bargaining law called Fair Pay Agreements. Labor allies in Britain plan to replicate fair pay agreements if they gain power. And in December, Australia legislated a new policy that promotes multi-employer bargaining. Today's panel continues our dialogue with labor unions in the US and around the world as we seek strategies to strengthen this nascent movement. This panel will help us understand what these sectoral policies do and why more and more unions are supporting them as they chart their path forward. We're fortunate to have key partners in this global movement represented in today's forum. With us today are Isabel Botts, Deputy General Secretary, Industrial European Trade Union, a federation of trade unions representing workers in 38 countries in the industrial sectors. Previously, she worked for the European Metalworkers Federation and as a senior policy advisor for Industrial Europe. She's reviewed some past CAP reports and has really been instructive in informing our direction on this issue. Joseph Bryant, my brother from the International Service Employers International Union. Joseph is an international EVP of SEIU, a union of 2 million diverse members in healthcare, the public sector, property, and other services. Bryant began as a work and file leader, who rose to lead his union, SEIU 1021, and is known as a leader advocating for racial and economic justice. Confession, I come up from the ranks of SEIU myself and feel particularly close to Bryant's journey and his mission. Craig Remney, economist and policy director from the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions, which represents 32 affiliated trade unions. Previously, Craig was a senior economic advisor for the New Zealand Minister of Finance. He's been on panels with David before and again has been a partner in our work. Really thrilled that Craig is joining us. Our moderator is David Madlin, who is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, the author of Reunion, How Bold Labor Reforms Can Repair, Revitalize, and Reunite the United States. Thank you all for your time today, for your partnership in this critical work. David, I hand the baton to you. Thank you for your leadership on this issue and for the steadfast enthusiasm and energy that you bring to the question of the future of workers.
Thank you, Patrick, for those kind words and those great introduction to this discussion that I'm really excited to get going. So with that, I really want to start right into some questions. Now, Craig, Joseph, and Isabel, you all and your unions help pass these policies that will promote sectoral bargain or standard setting, covering all workers in an industry or an occupation with basic standards. these policies are a really big deal. They can improve wages and working conditions, reduce economic inequality, boost productivity, even potentially address some concerns about democracy. I'd like to, these, Patrick mentioned some of the things these policies have been called groundbreaking, historic, generational, game changer. I was hoping you all could sort of set the table and explain what the policy that you supported and why you think it's so important. I'm going to start with Craig, then go to Joseph, then to Isabel, and I'd ask you to keep your remarks to 5 minutes or less so we can have a discussion. So I'm going to start with you, Craig. Floor is yours.
Thank you, David. I'll hopefully try and keep this to 5 minutes, although I could happily talk about fair pay agreements for the next 5 hours. Why is the Fair Pay Agreement Bill in New Zealand so important? It's not, as some would have it, a return to the past, a return to the 1970s, as some would have it in New Zealand. To us, it actually points to a future, a different future, in which workers and employers can come together to deliver meaningful change for workers in New Zealand. The bill creates common floors, common standards across an industry and occupation in areas like wages, hours, leave, and a number of other areas. And it also opens opportunities to talk about things like health and safety, opens opportunities to talk about things like training, development, a whole range of other areas. And importantly, these are bargained outcomes. These aren't dictated outcomes. These aren't outcomes delivered by government or anybody else. These are bargained freely by both sides. And so these agreements will have around 3 to 5 years of life, and they will create real opportunities both for trade unions and for workers. So as you say, to lift workers' living standards, to lift the terms and conditions, particularly in areas where workers haven't had power over the past 30 years, and to really build workers' power. I guess for us, the reason why we really care about this is because the economic evidence tells us that in New Zealand, over the past 30 years, we've seen an increasing growth in the gap between workers' productivity and output and wages. And that gap means that more and more of the New Zealand economy is going into the capital and into shareholders' pockets rather than into workers' pockets. And we've seen a growth in insecure work and a growth in a reduction in the terms and conditions of too many workers in New Zealand, with no real means of workers being able to address that. Alongside that, we've seen a decline in unionization levels. We've seen the level of union density in New Zealand fall from around 40% in 1991 to 20% this year. And so we want to arrest that change and turn it around, because at the same time as that fall in union density, we've also seen a big increase in inequality in New Zealand. We've seen a big increase in child poverty in New Zealand, and we've seen a big increase in worker insecurity in New Zealand. And we think those two things are linked. And fair pay agreements are a means by which we can help to address all of those things at once. Now, sectoral bargaining won't address all of these issues. It won't solve all of these problems. But for us, it's a big step in helping to deliver that. And it's a big step in helping to put workers back on a level playing field with employers in being able to negotiate where they haven't had unions in the past, where they haven't had access to collective bargaining in the past, and to make sure that their terms and conditions don't continue to slide as we've seen over the past 30 to 40 years.
Wow, well under 5. Nice job. Craig, thank you. Joseph, floor is yours.
Thank you, David. And again, just wanted to say thank you to Kat for hosting this vitally important conversation, and also the support on the passage of the Fast Recovery Act in California. And just before I get into the particulars of the policy, I just wanted to take a moment to really talk about what the problem is, the challenge is. The things that Craig were saying in regards to what's happening in New Zealand are very similar to the issues that are happening here in the US. The gap between the wealthy and everyone else in the US continues to grow, and it has continued to grow over the last 70 years. And if you're from a Black household, a brown household, or an API household, that gap is even wider. And we have a solution to that. The solution is fairly simple. The solution is that we expand workers' rights. We expand workers' democracy to be able to make decisions at their jobs. And we just expand organized labor and give allowance for more workers to be a part of organized labor. The other thing just to keep in mind at this point in time is we're at a place where the approval and demand for unions in the US are at a 50-year high. There's a recent polls done with approval ratings over 70%. And even with that happening, we see union membership in the US decline year over year over year, and particularly in private sector, which is hovering around 6% at this point in time. And with that, we know the rules are rigged against working people, and they're particularly rigged against Black, brown immigrant workers in this country who make up a large share of the low wage service work. We know that the federal labor law is broken, and while we're proponents of the PRO Act and other things being considered, workers can't wait. Workers are struggling to make ends meet day in, day out, and really can't afford to wait. So workers have been going to their state houses to demand change, demand rights, and that's what we did with what we call AB 257 or the Fast Recovery Act. And in California, we've certainly tried to lead on innovative legislation. We were the first state to pass the fight for $15 minimum wage. And even at that point in time, we were told, hey, this is crazy, this is unreasonable. And we have it at this point in time, and it's impacted millions of working families here in the state. And last year, with AB 257, the Fast Recovery Act, we intended to do the same thing. And why it's so important is it allows more than 500,000 workers to have the ability to sit down at the table with employers and government to improve their industry. And this is the first time this has happened in the United States, and we are so proud and excited about it. And just to add to it, this was a worker-led movement. These were fast food workers who were showing up day in, day out at the state capitol. Over 3,500 fast food workers went on went on strike in the last year. We had hundreds of actions that took place up and down the state, really to create the awareness of what is happening in the industry. It's not just poverty wages, but of course, poverty wages is a huge thing that we're trying to tackle with the legislation, but it's also to address other failures within the industry, like workplace violence, wage theft, sexual harassment, and other health and safety issues. So with that being said, we are extremely proud, we are extremely excited, and we know that we're going to have to fight to maintain this law because the corporations in this country, the multi-billion-dollar national corporations, are going to try to do any and everything in their power to take away the voices of working people. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. So Isabel, tell us about what's happening at the EU and Europe.
Thank you very much, David. And well, first of all, thanks to CAP for inviting me for this discussion today. It's actually very interesting to see how the realities are the same throughout the world. I mean, the two colleagues before, Craig and Joseph, has been talking about increased inequality, about in-work poverty, trade union density going down. I mean, this is also the context, the situation we are experiencing in Europe, and this is also the background for this new piece of legislation that we've called a historical moment, a paradigm shift. because for the first time we have a legally binding instrument which aims at promoting living and working condition of workers through adequate minimum wage. So we have two pillars: adequate minimum wage and also the promotion of collective bargaining in Europe. And of course, the idea in Europe, the economic reality is not the same everywhere. So the idea is not to have one minimum wage, but rather to create the condition for having adequate minimum wage for workers. But the second part of this legislation that was not initially part of the directive, but that the trade union movement demanded very strongly, is about promotion of collective bargaining. Because of course, I mean, minimum wage are important, adequate minimum wage are important, but in order to have fair wages for all, what is really important for us is to have negotiated wages. So as Patrick said in the introduction, I mean, the objective of this promotion of collective bargaining is to push for a collective bargaining of 80% in the member state in Europe. For the moment, out of the 27 member states, only 8 actually are meeting these targets, and the coverage for the moment is around 65%. So there is a lot of a job ahead of us. And of course, the reality between countries in terms of collective bargaining coverage is very different. So why is this legislation so important for us? It's, first of all, it's really a real paradigm shift in the sense that it's the end of the dominant thinking in Europe, where collective bargaining was really seen as part of a problem, especially after the financial crisis, where the Commission mantra was to dismantle, to decentralize collective bargaining. Now there is eventually a change of narrative where collective bargaining is seen as part of a solution. And we have already run a trade union campaign actually to show the benefit of collective bargaining for workers, of course, to make labor market more inclusive, but also for workers actually, for employers, because this is really important to create a level playing field for employers actually, to reduce competition, and also for the society as a whole. And of course, now we've seen during COVID how collective bargaining, how social partners have played a key role also in maintaining the economy running, but also in supporting workers. So we see now that with this directive, there has been a change of narrative, but now with the directive, what we see is that it's not only a change of narrative, but it's also concrete steps. Very important also for us is that with this directive, there is a recognition that collective bargaining cannot actually develop by itself. You need enabling framework actually for that. You need the government actually to create the condition for collective bargaining. And this is where we are now. And this is a challenge ahead of us now, because we have collectively, we have to make it happen in Europe.
Thank you, Isabel. Thank you all for setting the stage. So now we have a sense of what's happening in all countries, and I want to then turn to some sort of more specific questions. I'm going to start with you, Joseph, and ask you for your thoughts on what's next in California and other states. Where is this going? You alluded a little bit to this, that there's some employer opposition. There's a ballot initiative that's maybe a threat, but so what do you see next in California and in other states?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, even before the law could go into effect, fast food companies launched a full-scale attack on the bill, and have qualified a referendum, which essentially puts the law in pause at this point in time. They have already spent millions of dollars, really, to keep working families from having a voice at the table, because that is what we established with the law. And they are expected to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to overturn this law. It's essentially a playbook that's been created here in California, as to where these large corporations like gig or like oil, like tobacco, like the big fast food industries will spend millions and millions of dollars misleading the public to try to overturn laws or change laws. So that is what we're dealing with in terms of the status of the Fast Recovery Act, and the hope is really to think about the Fast Recovery Act. This is way beyond SEIU. This is even beyond the labor movement. This should be a fight for anyone who cares about preserving our democracy. And we have expectations of democracy, in the U.S. and in all facets, but there is no democracy when it comes to workers and workers' rights and workers' voices, particularly these workers. These are the same companies that fund election deniers, insurrectionists, and so many other bad things towards climate and other that are also trying to take away the voices of workers. So what we're doing with that is making sure that folks are informed, making sure that we put together the resources to make sure their attempts to take the voice of these workers away is defeated. So we're going to be calling upon everyone to make sure that the Fast Recovery Act does get put into effect as soon as possible. In terms of what we're doing beyond that, I think these efforts have inspired other work in establishment of sectoral bargaining around the country. In Minnesota, we have no nursing home workers that are pushing for sectoral standards board, which is very similar to the Fast Recovery Act within that area. Also in Massachusetts, rideshare drivers are similarly working on legislation to strengthen their ability to collective bargain, to be able to address things like minimum wage, sick time, unionization, and so forth. So similarly to the fight for 15 and establishing a $15 minimum wage in California, that is now taken shape throughout many states in the U.S. Our hope is that it'll be the same with sectoral bargaining. One, defend AB 257, and then expand AB 257 in sectoral bargaining throughout the country.
Great, thanks. Isabel, I'm going to ask you a similar question about sort of what's next in Europe, but I want to set it up a little bit because I think there's generally in the US some skepticism about what's happening in Europe. How relevant is it to the United States? We dream of it as a worker paradise, even though that's maybe not the actual reality. And so and some of the key difference in the US, most of our bargaining occurs at the workplace level, not at the sectoral level. But still, we do have some history and tradition of sectoral bargaining in the US. We can think of sort of the power model where we had very strong unions in, say, auto industry that were able to form a type of sectoral bargaining in that industry. We also have a kind of an extension model where we have our prevailing wage on government contracts that potentially extends some union standards to other workers. And the last are these sort of more governmental standards kind of boards that Joseph has been talking about. So I'm hoping you can sort of talk about what you are expecting and are hoping European countries to do to comply with this directive, how you think some of the places will deal with workplace bargaining alongside sectoral bargaining, and if they will be using some of these similar models of building unions and the extension and the governmental, and how it fits into the American conversation.
Well, actually, everything you've been saying fits to the European reality. Actually, I mean, this is all of this we are going to do. And again, listening to Joseph and the fight for trade union right. I mean, this is also where we're going to start in Europe. And actually, the legislation, when we talk about creating enabling condition, I mean, the law is very clear about that. I mean, government have to take measures to combat trade union busting, to actually support workers that want to join a union, because this is also a reality that we have in Europe. I mean, we have in a number of countries legislation which actually make it very difficult for trade union to workers for join a union. So, I mean, this is part of the, I would say, the first step. I mean, it's the first level actually that we have to deal with. And of course, the objective would be to develop sector bargaining wherever it's possible, because if we want to reach 80%, I mean, the only way to do it is through sector bargaining. But so we really have to look at all level to actually improve the situation. I mean, we often talk about we need action from above, but we also need action from below. We also are also very actively engaged into organizing, because trade union density also is going down, and in some countries it's very low in Europe. So we are also focusing on organizing, but also we are focusing at changing the law in some countries, and we have had some recent success because following the financial crisis due to the intervention of the Troika in a number of countries, the collective bargaining system were completely dismantled. Romania, for instance, or in Spain. And recently, we have seen some positive development where sector bargaining, the possibility to have sector bargaining has been made easier. So these are also source of inspiration for us at European level. But if I may say also, we are looking at you in the US as a source of inspiration, because with the IRA, you have actually introduced social conditionality that we would really have liked to have recently in our Green Deal industrial plan. I mean, and we really think that it's a missed opportunity for the European Union not to have looked at what you are doing in the US and introduce social conditionality.
Wow, some compliments to the US on our strings on government spending. So thank you. I'm going to, Craig, ask you a similar question about sort of what's next, but I also want you to touch on something that I think is important. So in New Zealand, you have workplace bargaining, but you haven't had sectoral bargaining in many decades. And I want to talk about why the union movement got behind this policy moving towards sectoral in addition to workplace. I know you face some skepticism among some unions that maybe we're going to lose out, or it's not our favorite. Why do we need this? Or we're going to have some free riders. So if you talk a little bit sort of what do you expect next with fair pay agreements, and then sort of especially highlight how the union movement came to view that you needed fair pay agreements in addition to workplace bargaining.
Thanks, David. I mean, I think it was highlighted earlier, sort of, unions exist to improve workers' lives and to build workers' power. And we believe that sectoral bargaining, fair pay agreements, as it's delivered in New Zealand, is one of the key things that we can do over the next few years to help deliver that in sectors that have particular problems with worker exploitation, increased fissuring of workplaces, and a reduction in worker power over time. And certainly, it's taken a long time to get to where we are now. It hasn't just happened overnight. If I head back to Helen Kelly, the late Helen Kelly, who started this work 10, 15 years ago in New Zealand. So, it's been a long path to get here. Why do we have skepticism? Why do we have some issues in the process to get here? It's taken a long time for a lot of organizations to realize that nothing else so far to date has helped to arrest that decline in union density. Nothing else has helped to arrest that increase in inequality, the increase in child poverty that we discussed earlier. And so if something needs to change, and something needs to change structurally in New Zealand, because over the past 30 years, employers have held too many of the cards when it comes to negotiating, to wage negotiations, and to a range of other factors. And so, I think there's been a gradual realization over time that collective bargaining through sectoral bargaining, through fair pay agreements, offers one of the best routes to help not only address that, but to reverse some of those challenges in New Zealand. And so, for us, it's about avoiding that race to the bottom that we've seen in too many industries. So if I take bus drivers, for example, in New Zealand, the bus is the same between different competitors. The fuel is the same between different competitors. The route is often the same between different competitors. The only thing that can get squeezed is the wages of the bus driver. So over 30 years, we saw decline after decline after decline in the terms and conditions of some sectors, especially those sectors where workers didn't have that bargaining power, didn't have that agency through unions or through the representation. And so sectoral bargaining offers the chance to re-level the playing field in those spaces in ways that actually help to put the onus back on the things that we want to see the economy grow on innovation, on product delivery, on service, on a range of other areas that actually help improve not only outcomes for workers, for consumers, but deliver a more resilient economy and a more productive economy in the future. So for unions, there's been a big process over a period of time of helping get to the point that actually this is actually the thing that we need to deliver. And a big part of that in New Zealand was actually when the 2017 Labour government was elected, there was a working group, a tripartite working group established to help set up and bring together the arrangements that would now form the bill. That brought unions inside the tent, that brought unions and businesses into the negotiations. And so it helped to create the conditions in which unions can see they've got a really strong role, that there's not free riding in that space, and that actually they've got a job in coming together to delivering better outcomes for workers, regardless of whether or not they're in their union, another union, or somewhere else. So there's, I think it's taken a while to get there, but where we've got to now offers a real opportunity to lift those standards and to do so in ways that actually increase worker power, increase union power for everyone. And if I just point to two very quick things in that, which help to sort of illustrate where that's really powerful for unions, one of which is inside the Fair Pay Agreements Bill, there's enhanced access in terms of stronger rights of access to workers for unions in New Zealand. That's really important because we'll be able to get access to workers who in the past we've really struggled to just get in front of, struggled to actually get into workplaces and talk to. And so that's really important for unions in New Zealand. And secondly, it allows us to negotiate terms and conditions in the round. It takes not just pay and hours, but it allows us to talk about training. It allows us to talk about health and safety. It allows us to talk about redundancy, industrial transition, a whole range of different areas. And so we can talk about more than just dollars and cents in people's pockets, but actually the things that possibly make a real difference in people's lives, like workplace flexibility, like the ability of making sure that as work changes, workers have the opportunity to train and retrain and to move with that time. So for unions, that offers brand new spaces in which to not only negotiate, but to deliver better outcomes for their members and for workers generally. So for us, it's taken us a while to get there. It's taken a lot of trust between unions to get there. And I think where we've got to is a really good space and places us really well in the future for being able to deliver better workplace outcomes for workers. And just say one final point, which is that nothing that we do inside a fair pay agreement is a maximum. So for unions, this is about creating a common floor. We still allow secondary bargaining on top. We still allow collective bargaining on top. All we're doing is stopping exploitation, and we're stopping the race to the bottom that we saw in various places. And that's really important. There's still a really strong role for unions to deliver collective coverage, collective bargaining on top of a fair pay agreement. A fair pay agreement simply creates the floor beneath which no one should fall, because actually that's the level in that industry. And that improves the lives of not only workers, it improves things like pay equity. It improves pay transparency. It improves, pay justice between different people in different areas. And so making that public, making everyone understand that it's actually a really important part of why unions are here, and really helps illustrate the positive role that unions can play, not only in individual workplaces, but across the economy in lifting that productivity and that social justice lens.
Thank you, Craig. There was one last, that you hit on a lot there, and I saw Isabel nodding, so I'm going to get you to chime in on what you were thinking, but if you could just finish up with what's sort of happening now. Fair pay agreements are starting to be negotiated, but they're under threat, and then we'll get to Isabel.
Thank you. I got carried away there, David. In terms of what's happening now, the bill has become an act, so it's now law. We have a number of unions who have applied for what we call coverage, which simply means they're starting the ball rolling on the delivery of fair pay agreements. I believe last time I checked, we had 5 fair pay agreements that have been applied for. We anticipate that that there will be fair pay agreements in reality before the election in October 14th this year. And so for us, there's a really important job about embedding fair pay agreements in New Zealand. And one of the things that we need to do right now is to defend them, because the opposition in New Zealand has said that if they come to office, they're going to remove them from New Zealand law and remove the benefits that workers will get from them in New Zealand law. So we're trying to get as many start as we can, but also start to ramp up union organization and development to deliver them across as many areas as we can, but also then defend them as we head into the election campaign.
Great, thanks, Isabella. Before I give you the floor, I just want to remind the audience that if you have questions, we'll be taking them soon. So please submit away, either through the chat function or I think there's Twitter or email that you've been provided. So please do that. So Isabel, you were nodding vigorously when Craig was talking about why unions might support these kind of policies. So walk us through that.
I was actually 100% supporting what Craig was saying about the benefits of sector bargaining, because this is exactly what we will be now facing in some countries, because in some countries we have already well-established sector agreement, but in other countries it's still mainly company bargaining actually. And we have actually also to sell to our own colleagues the benefits of sector bargaining actually. The fact that you actually are in a sector like the metal sector into a community with OEMs, with actually suppliers, and the idea is actually to share the added value among that community actually. And you also pointed out it's also about organizing working time, but also what is really important is training. Actually in industry, it's extremely important also. It's important for workers actually to be able within their sector to access training, but also we sell it as an added value to employers actually, because I mean, they want to invest into training, but they are always afraid that their workers will be actually attracted in other companies actually. But if you have a level playing field actually, where all the workers across the sector have the same benefit, then it's also creating a level playing field for employers. So I could not agree more to the explanation that was given by Craig.
And Joseph, one thing that when Craig was also talking, so we're going to tee off you, Craig, was when he was describing bus drivers, I couldn't help but think of the fast food workers that you are pushing for, trying to create this sectoral council. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about sort of the structure of that industry and why you thought the sectoral solution was so important.
Sure. I mean, one of the reasons why it was so important is because this is one of the most exploited groups of workers in the state of California, predominantly made of, women and people of color. And again, with a workforce of over 500,000, it just, really, compelled us in our minds to say, and I think Craig captured it perfectly in terms of we need to address, basic standards of life in many other different types of industries. There are basic standards, but particularly in the U.S., when you think about work predominantly done by people of color, Black, Brown, API. This idea of having a baseline standard, really seems to be, less critical, less founded. And so as we, thought about, where to start, because we really think that this is a start in terms of, the expansion. We needed to address the folks who needed it the most. And there's been, even, I think, since the start of the pandemic, more of a calling of these workers to say, hey, we need standards. I think there's a thing that, we all go through, particularly, frontline workers, to where if you go into work with the idea that you're, potentially, risking your life, it just changes your perspective in terms of, what the expectations could be and should be. And I think that's really exacerbated, really a real desire, a workers-led desire and movement to really see sectoral bargaining in this space.
Great. Thanks. I'm going to ask one sort of last question, and then I turn to audience questions. And this is a question for all of you, just talking about the challenges to enacting your policies, that how it happened, how you were able to either build the right coalition, overcome ideological opposition, moneyed opposition. So, and if you could keep the answers brief on this one, especially so we can have time to get to audience, but I think it'd be useful to sort of hear how you move forward. I'm going to start with Joseph and then go to Isabel and then Craig.
Yeah, I think one would think in, triple blue liberal California, passing something like this would be easy. It was not. It was very challenging. And, actually the first time it was introduced, it was not passed. But we did, I think the thing that was, most effective in changing, the state legislators' position is hearing from the workers, hearing day in, day out, the struggles, the challenges, being harassed, having no place. Anytime there's any issue brought up, having, being, removed from the job, being fired. I think it was just it was really the thing that compelled it and fueled it was the passion, from workers that, brought their families out to talk to, lawmakers to say, hey, this is something that, we need to survive. So I'll keep it brief there.
Shall I go on? Yeah, well, very, very briefly, I mean, clearly it's growing inequalities in work, poverties, and the fact, I mean, you ought to remember that in Europe, in some countries, collective bargaining systems have been dismantled from one day to another, with really, really appalling results, actually. And this is actually this situation that actually brought, politician, but of course the social movement to denounce the situation and to call for a change of policy. And obviously, the neoliberal policies have proved to be wrong, and the recipe of the Troika have proved to be wrong, actually. So there was many voices that were pointing at the need for change. We have now the instrument, but I mean, we really have to make it happen, actually, because there are still on the ground, I mean, some government, but also employers that will do everything to prevent this to happen.
Thanks, Isabel. In New Zealand, fair pay agreements have gone on that classic journey. Again, the other idea, it's gone from ridiculous to interesting to sensible to obvious once it's sort of worked its way through the process. And for us, it's been very much about keeping workers' voices and the stories of workers front and center, so we can explain how this will benefit workers themselves. Workers, individual workers explaining how you have worker exploitation, you've had loss of worker power, and how workers have lost out over the increasingly individualized process negotiating work pay in terms and conditions. Putting fair pay agreements on the table as a means of addressing that and helping to demonstrate to them and to New Zealanders that there are benefits for some of the most vulnerable workers in New Zealand has really been key. And I guess there's been two things that we've been lucky, for want of a better phrase, in that space. One of which is COVID, which really helped to demonstrate that actually we didn't have the number of essential workers in New Zealand was actually much larger than we thought it was. It included supermarket workers, it included cleaners, it included security guards. And so that ability to tell that story of these are also essential workers, as are many other people in New Zealand, and that's why they need fair pay, and fair pay agreements can deliver that. It's been a really central story. But like Isabel and like Joseph have said, we're not finished yet. You know, we've got the Act in place, we've got some fair pay agreements started, but there's still a real risk at the election that we lose the ability to continue with this really powerful change in New Zealand employment law. So we need to keep up the pressure and keep up those stories of why that will make such a positive difference.
All right, thanks. I'm going to turn to audience questions. And actually our first, I think, is a nice continuation of this question I just asked about the sort of politics of getting these bills passed. It actually comes from Mary Kay Henry, the president of SEIU, who's been a big supporter of moving sectoral bargaining. And it asks sort of what steps did you take in Europe and New Zealand to get this happening? And did it require all of civil society to unite behind labor's demands? And was the entire labor movement united? And so I think it's a nice follow-on that's to talk really especially about sort of the union politics of moving this forward and the union working with other parts of civil society. I'm Isabel and then Craig, and then Joseph, if you want to join in on anything there.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, throughout Europe, it has been a long standing demands, actually. And of course, the labor movement was very much mobilized, but also I would say, the progressive forces. And of course, for us, the European Parliament played an important role. And I mean, as I said in the beginning, we had first, the initial law was focusing on adequate minimum wage, but really managed to enlarge it also to cover collective bargaining, because we also think that this is the best way to get fair wages. But of course, as we've said before, with collective bargaining, we are not only dealing with wages, we are also dealing with a whole kind of issues that related to working condition. And this is what is important also for us.
In New Zealand, civil society, as represented by unions and non-government organisations and others, have been really together in helping to support and promote fair pay agreements, particularly those parts of NGOs that represent what you may call the progressive movement in particular areas. It's been a bit more of a challenge to get all businesses across the line. A big part of that was the tripartite process, the working group process, which took a year. Worked with businesses, worked with business organizations and their representatives to help bring together the Act as it's written now. But there was also a very deliberate process by government to travel the country in New Zealand and talk to audiences all over New Zealand to sort of explain what was a fair pay agreement, why they were necessary, and what benefits they would bring to workers. So there's been a lot of very deliberate steps in the process to try and bring people together to talk about it and to help explain why this change is necessary. And I'd say certainly in its modern incarnation, the union movement's been very united in the need for the Fair Pay Agreements Bill and for the Fair Pay Agreements Act as is now. And our key job is to embed it and improve it as we can and as we go.
The next set of questions I'm going to read are really focused kind of on unions and sectoral, sort of what's in it for unions, not just broadly as we have this mission to lift all workers, but really sort of focusing on sort of particulars. And I'm going to try to read them as much as possible to get the sort of the vibe correct. So is sectoral bargaining going to lead to increased union membership and increased power? How is sectoral bargaining used as a tool to increase union movement? And then a related kind of question is that there's this perception among some that sectoral bargaining maybe is a shortcut or a workaround from building bottom-up worker power through unions. Is it true that strong unions are always required to make sectoral bargaining work? And so this relationship between power and the bargaining structure. I'm going to start, Joseph, since you jump in, sort of how you think about the Fast Recovery Act and unions there.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, and I think Craig covered it extensively around, this concept of there being, without standards, it's really a race to the bottom. And our approach in regards to sectoral bargaining is really to raise all tides. Similarly to what we did for the Fight for 15, establishing $15 minimum wage. If you raise the standards for everyone, it will continue to raise the standards, whether you're a union member or not. And really, our role as labor in the movement is to raise the standards and wages of all workers. We stay firm in the approach towards lifting up all working families and also giving space and opportunity for working families who are not in a union to have accessibility to a union. Again, the rules are so rigged to where you have a large percentage of workers who want to join a union and just can't. So our approach is really, if we raise all tides, one, it takes away the ability for companies or services to undercut one another. Hey, we have a minimum floor. So it addresses the perspective of these companies spending millions and millions of dollars on firms to really fight unions and fight unionization. So we absolutely do believe that one, again, if you raise the tides for all workers, it'll lift standards for everyone. And we do feel that if we're intentional about how we approach sectoral bargaining, it will provide more worker power, and we need it. If labor unions aren't doing it, who else is having these conversations?
Great. Isabel, the relationship between power and bargaining, and then how does the sectoral help union membership?
Well, actually, I'd like to say to start with by saying that behind the idea of sector bargaining, you have also the idea of solidarity between workers within the same sector, actually, and building together some minimum standards, minimum wage that often, but also minimum standards in terms of health and safety, in terms of working conditions. So it's really about building a community. But to your specific question, I mean, it's clear that we see, I mean, I take the example of Germany, where the sector bargaining is extremely well structured and organized. The preparation for the collective bargaining round, the mobilization also, and I would say all the fuss that goes with it, actually, it's also a moment for the unions to gain members, because workers that are not in companies which actually are not covered by the agreement, they see the demand, and the unions are also extremely good at communicating about the differences. I mean, if you are covered by the collective agreement, this is your wage. If you're not, actually, you have a lower wages. So this is extremely powerful, actually, in terms of communication to bring new members, and therefore new companies, because then companies are actually also forced to join the sector agreement.
I
Craig?
don't want to add much to what Joseph and Isabel have already said, which is, that there's quite clearly a role for unions in terms of fair pay agreements in New Zealand. One of the big issues is access. Sectoral bargaining gives us access to brand new sectors of workers and to workers who may not otherwise, as Joseph had said, had access to the unions that they actually want. to access to. And so for us, this is very much about being able to put unions front and center in workplaces, able to talk to workers, talk to the benefits. It's very early days in the fair pay agreement system in New Zealand. It's just become law. And there's a lot of evolution to go, and probably a lot of maturing to go in how we deal with all of this. But we don't need to look much past the core mission of unions, which is, as Isabel said, solidarity. In working together to deliver better outcomes for workers. That's why we're here, and that's what we believe sectoral bargaining will help to deliver. And that's probably a good enough reason for unions to get involved in the first place.
We've got one last audience. We've got many more, but one last audience question that I think we'll have time for, and it's about enforcement of these sectoral agreements. And I wonder if you could, each of you, talk about it. But I also think it really leads into this question of what's in it for unions as well. I actually wrote a piece a little bit a while ago about Amazon in Italy, where they secured one of the best collective bargaining agreements with Amazon in the entire world, in part because there was a sectoral standard and the unions were organizing to help enforce that Amazon was going to comply with an already existing standard. So I'm going to go in the opposite order. We'll start Craig, Isabel, and Joseph. Talk about enforcement of your standards, of your policies, and how you think that will work.
It's a great question, and it's one that we're still, again, in very early days in New Zealand. We have a labour inspectorate in New Zealand, but the crucial thing is that these aren't private contracts. When we create a fair pay agreement, we're creating secondary legislation. So this is law. So everyone is automatically covered if they're inside the coverage of a fair pay agreement. Failure to comply with that is an offence under law. So it has a different standard to that of being a private contract between a worker and an employer. So so that is a very different sort of look and feel. But there's a really big job of work to make sure that we have sufficient capacity, both within the union movement and within the government, to actually deliver the kinds of enforcement that we will need in this area. But a big part of the union's job is to help raise the voices of workers where they're not seeing that enforcement, where they're not seeing those lifting standards, and to help make sure that they're then heard and those standards are being delivered when we create the fair pay agreements of the future.
Isabel, if you could keep it to 1 minute so we can give Joseph the last 1 minute to finish up.
Totally in agreement with Greg, and this is what I call the enabling environment, actually. I mean, this is then the role of a government to step in and put in place the labour inspectorate, also, all kind of the labour court, actually, that will make sure that companies comply with what they have subscribed to through the collective agreement.
Joseph, last word on enforcement.
In regards to enforcement, again, the creation of standards and having the space where again, the potential of the Fast Recovery Act in California could lead to fast food workers having 150,000 fast food workers as part of a worker organization. And the level of, I think, just the empowerment and how it impacts, again, some of the most exploited, groups and people in California, and the empowerment that it builds in Black, Brown, API communities, really actually fuels the enforcement as it pertains to the implementation.
Got it. Organizing as enforcement. I will leave it as the last word. And thank you very much, Joseph, Isabel, and Craig, for your time. And thank you, audience, for staying with us for this discussion. And I look forward to future discussions in this topic. Thank you very much. Thank you all.